While plowing his field, a farmer stumbled upon an old grave. He decided to dig deeper, thinking it was just a forgotten stone. But what he unearthed changed his life forever and revealed a terrifying secret about his family. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning sun had only begun to lift above the low hills when Tobias Marsh guided his old tractor into the northern field. The machine rattled and coughed as it always did, a relic of another era that refused to quit so long as Tobias gave it his steady hand and patient attention. The air was still cool, carrying the scent of dew-soaked grass and freshly turned earth, and for a moment he felt the faint comfort of routine, the familiarity of labor that had shaped his life since boyhood. The fields stretched wide and quiet around him, their furrows waiting for his plow, and in that quiet he almost forgot how lonely the farm had grown since Ruth's passing and the departure of his children. The tractor lumbered forward, the steel blades of the plow biting into the soil. Tobias sat upright, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on his knee, eyes narrowed against the brightening light. His life had become this, work that began before the sun was warm and ended long after it disappeared. The farm gave him order, and order was a comfort against the silence of an empty house. Yet the silence weighed on him all the same, settling on his shoulders as heavily as the years had. He pushed it aside as he always did, focusing on the simple rhythm of furrow after furrow, the ground splitting open in neat lines behind him. He had nearly reached the edge of the field when the plow jerked violently, lurching the tractor sideways and throwing Tobias forward against the steering wheel. He braked instinctively, his pulse quickening as the machine shuddered to a halt. His first thought was the usual one: a buried stone or a root too thick for the blades. With a weary sigh, he climbed down, boots sinking into the soft soil, and walked back to inspect the obstruction. At first glance, it was just that, a stone protruding from the earth, dull gray against the darker soil. But as Tobias crouched closer, brushing away the dirt with his calloused hand, he felt his breath catch. The surface was not rough like a common rock, but flat and worked by human hands. Faint grooves ran across it, worn by years, perhaps decades of wind and rain. He leaned closer and saw the suggestion of letters, almost erased by time yet still there, if one looked hard enough. He squinted, rubbed harder, and finally discerned what they formed: a name. He froze. The letters were faint but unmistakable, a surname he knew better than any other, his own: Marsh. The same name carved on the mailbox at the end of the dusty road, the same name carried through generations of his family that had lived and died on this land. Tobias stared, heart beating fast in his chest as if the stone itself had spoken. A headstone, here in the middle of a working field, with his own family's name etched upon it. For a long moment he stayed crouched in the dirt, unwilling to move, the morning sun creeping higher behind him. Questions crowded his mind in a jumble he could not organize. He knew the land intimately, every dip and rise, every stubborn rock that dulled his plow, every patch where the soil ran dry too quickly. Never once had anyone mentioned a grave out here. His father had spoken often of the farm's history, of the sacrifices made by the Marsh men to hold on to their acres through drought and war and hardship. But not once had he spoken of a grave in the fields, nor had his grandfather before him. Yet here it was, silent and undeniable. He stood at last, brushing dirt from his knees, and looked around as though expecting someone to appear from the horizon to explain. But the field was empty. The only sound the tick of the tractor's cooling engine and the faint cry of a hawk overhead. The stone sat half-buried, weathered and lonely, its presence both ordinary and utterly out of place. Tobias pressed his lips together, unsettled by the feeling that the land had revealed something it had long intended to keep hidden. He considered the practical response. He could haul it out, drag it to the edge of the property, and move on. The plow would run straight again, and the harvest would not be delayed. But as he touched the stone once more, tracing the shallow grooves of his family name, he knew he could not simply dismiss it as debris. This was not a common stone. It was a marker, a sign left by someone before him, and to ignore it felt like ignoring the very ground that sustained him. The day wore on, but Tobias found his thoughts drifting again and again to the stone as he finished the rest of his work. His hands guided the tractor with their usual steadiness, Yet his eyes kept flicking to the northern edge of the field, to that patch of dirt where the plow had struck. By evening, when he returned the tractor to the barn and set aside his tools, he felt no satisfaction in the day's labor. Instead, a low unease clung to him, following him across the yard and into the kitchen. The house greeted him with its usual silence. He brewed himself coffee, though it was late, the bitterness sharp on his tongue as he sat at the table, staring at the darkened window. Once, Ruth would have been there, humming while she prepared supper, her presence filling the house with warmth. Once, the children would have thundered down the stairs, voices raised in complaint or laughter, the din of life chasing away any silence. Now there was only Tobias, the ticking of the old clock on the wall, and the memory of a stone bearing his family name buried in his field. He tried to tell himself it was nothing. A remnant of some long-forgotten past, perhaps a distant cousin or tenant farmer whose name had by chance matched his own. The land was old and many had walked it before him. Yet no matter how he reasoned, the unease remained. His father had known this land. His grandfather had known it. If a grave lay in the field, they would have known too. Why had they never spoken of it? Why had the stone been left unmarked, overgrown, swallowed by earth until a plow unearthed it again? That night he lay in bed unable to sleep, the ceiling above him a pale blur in the moonlight. The stone haunted his thoughts, the faint grooves of the letters etched into his mind. He turned onto his side, pulled the blanket tighter, but the questions would not relent. The silence of the farm, once comforting, now felt oppressive, as though it were waiting for him to act. At last he told himself he would return in the morning, not as a farmer tending his land, but as a man seeking an answer. He would bring a shovel. He would dig. And though the thought filled him with unease, he knew he would not resist it. The field had offered him a secret, and whether he wanted it or not, he was now bound to uncover what lay beneath. The next morning broke pale and thin, the light hesitant as it spread across the farm, and Tobias rose with a heaviness he could not shake. Sleep had not come easily, and when it did, it was restless, full of strange half-dreams in which the stone in the field seemed to swell until it towered over him like a monument. He had told himself he would wait, that the field could be left alone until the season's work allowed him time. But as soon as his boots touched the cool floorboards, he knew it was a lie. The stone had been waiting long before he had discovered it, and now it seemed to wait for him in particular. He made his coffee and drank it without tasting, his eyes fixed on the window where the pale sky was slowly brightening over the northern acres. The ordinary rhythm of his morning chores felt distant, hollow, as though his body moved through them without his mind's consent. He carried the feed buckets to the barn, scattered grain for the hens, checked the water troughs for the horses, yet the thought of the headstone pressed on him like a weight strapped to his back. When the chores were finished, he fetched a spade from the tool shed and carried it across the yard. The field was quiet, the soil damp with dew, the smell of earth rising sharp in the cool air. The tractor sat where he had left it, its blades still marked by yesterday's sudden halt, and just beyond it, the stone jutted from the ground, gray and patient. Tobias approached slowly, spade in hand, his breath unsteady though the morning was calm. The stone seemed smaller than it had in the shock of discovery, but no less insistent. He crouched beside it again, brushed away more dirt, and felt the letters with his fingertips as if to confirm they were still there. Marsh. His name, carved by someone long gone, waiting in silence for him to read. He drove the spade into the soil beside the stone. The ground was stubborn at first, the clay gripping the blade as though reluctant to yield, but with each thrust the soil loosened, and he heaved it aside in clumps. His breath grew heavy, the muscles in his back straining, sweat prickling beneath his shirt despite the coolness of the hour. At first he told himself it was idle curiosity, that he only wanted to see how deep the marker went, whether it was a single stone or part of something larger. But as the hole widened and the stone's base revealed itself, another shape began to emerge from the dirt, one that froze him in place. Beneath the stone lay fragments of wood, rotted and soft, collapsing under his touch. He pulled more earth aside and realized it was not merely a plank, but the remains of a box, a coffin crudely fashioned and now half dissolved by time. His heart quickened, a dull thudding in his chest, and for a moment he considered filling the hole again, pretending he had never begun. But the sight of those splintered boards held him, and his hands moved almost of their own accord, scraping away more earth until he uncovered a scrap of fabric, then a curve of bone pale against the soil. Tobias dropped back on his heels, the spade slipping from his grip. He had known, of course, what a headstone implied, but knowing and seeing were two different things. Here lay a body, buried in his field, and with it a story that had been hidden longer than his own lifetime. His first impulse was to cover it again, to press the soil back until the field was whole. But even as the thought crossed his mind, his eyes caught on something else. Near the collapsed boards, half buried in dirt, was a small iron box streaked with rust. His breath shallow, Tobias reached down and heaved the box free. It was heavier than it looked, its hinges stiff with decay. But after a moment of effort, the lid creaked open. Inside lay papers, bundled in twine, their edges frayed, the ink faded but still legible. He lifted one with trembling fingers and squinted at the neat, stern handwriting. It was a debt contract, dated nearly a century ago. The name of the debtor was unfamiliar, but the creditor's name leapt out at him, sharp as a blow. Jonas Marsh, his grandfather. He flipped through more, his heart pounding faster with each page. They were all the same contracts, notes of debt, promises of repayment, each one signed by men whose names carried the sound of immigrant laborers, men who had come to the county seeking a better life and found themselves bound instead. And always at the bottom, the signature of Jonas Marsh, sometimes joined by Samuel Marsh, Tobias's father, when he was old enough to take part. The terms were merciless, impossible interest, payment demanded in labor, land seized when the debt could not be met. The weight of the papers pressed on him as though they were bricks, not parchment. He felt his stomach twist, his throat tighten. He had grown up hearing stories of how his grandfather had been a hard man, but fair, a pillar of the community who had fought through lean years to hold the farm together. Tobias had repeated those stories himself, proud of his lineage, grateful for the land passed down to him. But these papers told another story, one of exploitation, of profit wrung from the desperation of others. For a long while he sat there in the dirt, the box beside him, the bones beneath him, and felt the shape of his life shift. The farm he had tended, the land he had believed in, was not the honest legacy he had been told. It was built on debts and secrets buried as surely as the coffin at his feet. He wanted to deny it, to claim the papers were lies or misunderstandings. But the handwriting was his grandfather's, steady and undeniable. The truth lay before him, and no amount of soil could cover it again. At last he gathered the papers back into the box, his hands clumsy, his breath shallow. He pushed the lid closed and sat staring at the grave as though it might offer him guidance. But the grave was silent, the stone bearing his name mute and patient. He thought of his father, of the way the man had carried himself with stern pride, of the stories he had told Tobias when he was a boy. How many of them had been lies, or at least half-truths carefully chosen to hide what he did not want seen? How much of the farm's survival had been won not by sweat and toil, but by the suffering of men who had no choice? When at last Tobias rose to his feet, the light had shifted, the sun climbing high above the fields. His back ached from the digging, his palms raw, but the ache inside his chest was worse. He could not unsee what he had uncovered, could not forget the weight of the box in his hands or the bones lying beneath the soil. He hefted the spade again, unsure whether to close the grave or leave it open, but in the end he laid the tool aside. The field could wait. The work could wait. He would return, he told himself, though even as he thought it, he knew the pull of the stone, and the box would not let him rest until he did. That night the house felt colder than before, the silence sharper. He set the iron box on the kitchen table and poured himself whiskey, staring at the rusted hinges, the faded papers within. He did not open it again, not yet, but the presence of it was enough. It sat there like a witness, patient as the stone in the field, reminding him that the life he thought he knew had cracks running deep beneath its surface. He drank without tasting, his eyes drifting to the window, where the dark pressed against the glass. Somewhere beyond that darkness lay the grave, the bones, the stone with his family's name. He had told himself in the morning that curiosity was a nuisance, something to be indulged and then dismissed. But now he knew better. Curiosity had opened the ground, and the ground had answered. What it had shown him was not only a grave, but a shadow stretched long across his family's history, a shadow that no amount of silence could erase. And though Tobias feared what more he might find, he knew he would return to the field again. The truth was waiting, and the soil had only just begun to give it up. The iron box remained on the kitchen table long into the night, its rusted surface glinting faintly in the light of the lamp, as Tobias sat with his hands folded before it, staring. He had not opened it again after placing the papers back inside, but their presence weighed on him all the same. The neat handwriting of his grandfather, the harsh conditions of the contracts, the names of men who had come with nothing and left with less, they echoed in his thoughts with each passing hour. His whiskey glass sat untouched beside him, the amber liquid forgotten as his mind circled around the grave in the field. When he finally rose from the table, his body heavy with exhaustion, the box seemed almost to watch him, demanding to be remembered even as he extinguished the lamp and went upstairs. Sleep offered no relief. His dreams were thick with soil, with the pale gleam of bones, with the scrape of his spade against something hidden. He woke more than once with the sensation that someone had called his name, only to find the house silent and dark. By dawn, he gave up on rest altogether and dressed himself, the iron box still sitting where he had left it, a silent witness to the secrets of his bloodline. He thought for a moment of locking it away in the barn or burying it back in the earth, but the thought of covering it again filled him with unease, as though silence would make him complicit. He left it on the table and walked out into the chill morning air, his spade over his shoulder, heading once more to the northern field. The ground was damp with early dew, the furrows dark against the pale sky. The stone stood where he had left it, gray and steady, a small sentinel in the middle of his acres. Tobias's boots sank into the soil as he crossed the field, each step heavier than the last, until he stood again at the edge of the grave. The boards of the coffin had collapsed further, softened by time and his digging, and the fabric he had uncovered lay dark with moisture. He swallowed against the tightness in his throat and forced himself to kneel, pushing away more soil. At first he meant only to confirm what he had seen before, to reassure himself that his mind had not exaggerated the discovery. But as his hands worked, brushing aside clumps of clay, his spade struck something small and metallic. The sound was dull but distinct, different from stone or wood. Tobias froze, his pulse quickening, then bent closer and scraped away the soil with his fingers until the object emerged. It was a plaque, no larger than the palm of his hand, tarnished and green with age. He lifted it carefully, the weight surprising, the metal cool against his skin. Dirt clung to its surface, but beneath the grime he could see the faint etching of letters. He wiped it with the edge of his sleeve, and the inscription revealed itself in uneven lines. At first he struggled to read, the letters worn by time, but then they sharpened into a name. The moment his eyes recognized it, a jolt shot through him, as though the ground had shifted under his knees. The name was his own. Tobias stared at the plaque, his breath shallow, his hands trembling. It was not just the surname Marsh, as he had seen on the headstone, but the full name of a man who had lived a century earlier and carried the same blood. For a moment Tobias could not think, could not breathe. His mind recoiled from the truth, grasping at explanations that dissolved as quickly as they formed. A coincidence? Impossible. A distant relative? Perhaps. But why here, buried in secrecy, with a crude coffin and a hidden box of contracts? He placed the plaque gently on the ground beside him and sat back, wiping sweat from his brow, though the morning air was still cool. The weight of the discovery pressed on him, heavier than the iron box had been. This was no longer the story of faceless laborers exploited by his grandfather, a sin broad and cruel but still distant. This was blood, his own family's blood, bound to the same soil he worked each day. The grave was not just a relic of injustice but a betrayal, a reminder that his heritage was built not only on greed but on the suffering of one of their own. The memory of his father surfaced then, stern and unyielding, his voice recounting tales of honor and endurance, of how the marshline had survived hardship through strength and perseverance. Tobias could hear him as clearly as if the man stood beside him, repeating the words he had grown up believing, that their name was a symbol of resilience, that their land was hard-earned and rightful. But now, with the plaque in his hand, Tobias saw those stories as shadows cast to conceal something darker. The land had not been won by sweat alone. It had been taken, and one of their own had been erased to ensure that no one questioned the taking. He looked down into the grave, at the remnants of fabric, the pale arc of bone, the fragments of a life reduced to dust. The plaque had not been meant to be found. It had been buried with him, a silent marker that should have disappeared as the years turned. Yet it remained, as if waiting for the day when one of his descendants would come upon it and be forced to reckon with the truth. Tobias rose slowly, the plaque clutched tightly in his hand. He stood over the grave, the weight of silence pressing on him from all sides, the field stretching out indifferent and endless. His eyes drifted across the horizon, but there was no comfort in the familiar land. Every furrow seemed altered now, every fence post, every tree. The farm he had thought of as his anchor was suddenly a stranger, its roots tangled with secrets he could not untangle. He carried the plaque back to the house, each step heavy, his boots leaving dark prints in the soil. In the kitchen he placed it beside the iron box, the two objects side by side, both testaments to a history his family had sought to bury. He sat at the table once more, his hands resting on the wood, and stared at them until the light shifted, until the day grew old and the shadows lengthened. As evening fell, the house seemed colder still. He lit the lamp but found no comfort in its glow. The plaque gleamed faintly, the letters etched into it, stubbornly refusing to fade, the same letters that marked his own name on the mailbox at the end of the lane. Tobias leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and pressed his hands to his face. The weight of it all pressed down on him until he thought he might collapse beneath it. When he lowered his hands, the box and plaque remained, waiting. He reached out and touched the plaque again, the metal cool and unyielding, and felt a chill run through him. He knew then that he could not ignore it, could not bury it again, and return to the life he had known. The land had given up its secret, and it demanded to be heard. He would have to follow where it led, no matter how deep into the past it took him. That night, as he lay awake in the narrow bed, Tobias felt the farm pressing on him in a way it never had before. The creak of the timbers, the groan of the wind against the walls, the distant call of an owl, all of it seemed to speak the same message. Nothing was as he had been told. He turned on his side, clutching the blanket, but the truth lay beside him as surely as any companion, and he knew there would be no peace until he uncovered it fully. The next day he would leave the farm, at least for a time. He would go to town, to the library, to the courthouse, to the archives. He would look for the name carved into the plaque, the name that matched his own, and find out what story had been hidden beneath his family's silence. He did not know yet what he would uncover, but the pull was too strong to resist. The stone in the field had given him a secret, and the plaque had given it shape. Now the past was calling him forward, and he could not turn away. The morning after Tobias had uncovered the metal plaque was heavy with clouds, the light dim and uncertain as though the sky itself carried the same unease that pressed on him. He rose early, not because he had slept well, but because sleep had abandoned him altogether, leaving him restless in the dark. When he sat at the kitchen table and looked once more at the plaque and the rusted iron box, he felt the weight of decision settle on his shoulders. He could no longer pretend that these things were curiosities, odd relics from a past too distant to matter. They were anchors dragging him down, demanding that he learn what they meant. His own name had been carved into a plaque and laid in a grave. His grandfather's signature ran across debt contracts like a seal of condemnation. The silence of his family had hidden these truths, but now silence was impossible. He made his coffee and drank it quickly, though it did nothing to settle his nerves. The farm, usually his refuge, felt suddenly like a prison whose walls were built of unanswered questions. The fields stretched out as they always had. The barn stood crooked in its familiar way. The animals moved in their habitual rhythms, but none of it offered comfort. Every fence post, every blade of grass seemed a whisper of secrets, of lies unspoken. Tobias knew he could not stay here today, not with those whispers gnawing at him. He would go into town. He would seek the truth in the places where paper had preserved what memory and conscience had buried. The drive was long, the narrow road winding between fields that were greening with the early promise of summer. Tobias kept his eyes on the horizon, his hands steady on the wheel though his thoughts churned. He remembered his father's stories, the tales of endurance and strength that had shaped his understanding of who the Marsh family was. He remembered the pride in his grandfather's voice when he had spoken of holding on to the land through hard times. Those stories had been the foundation of Tobias's identity, the backbone of his faith in himself. Now they felt fragile, brittle things, like old wood ready to splinter at a touch. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, as though he could hold those stories together by force of will. But the plaque's cold letters haunted him. The man in the ground had carried his name. That truth could not be denied. The courthouse stood at the center of town, its white stone facade weathered but sturdy, the flag above it stirring in the breeze. Tobias parked his truck at the edge of the square and sat for a moment, staring at the building as if it might resist his entry. He felt like a man about to cross a threshold he could not return from, but he forced himself out of the truck and mounted the steps. Inside, the air smelled of dust and paper, and the quiet was thick, broken only by the faint echo of footsteps on tile. The clerk at the records office gave him a curious glance when he asked for access to the old property deeds and debt ledgers, but she did not question him. With a shrug, she led him to the archive room, where rows of cabinets and shelves stretched in dim light. The space was hushed as though the voices of the past lingered in the papers, waiting to be heard again. Tobias removed his hat, set it aside, and began to search. Hours passed as he pored over ledgers bound in cracked leather, their pages yellowed with age. His eyes grew sore from squinting at faded ink, his fingers smudged with the dust of decades, but slowly a pattern began to emerge. The names leapt out at him, familiar in their cadence though foreign to his tongue. Immigrant names, names of men who had come seeking opportunity, recorded here instead as debtors. The figures told their story clearly. Loans granted for seed and tools at impossible interest. Payments demanded in labor that could never cover the sum. With each page Tobias turned, he felt his chest grow tighter. The handwriting of Jonas Marsh appeared again and again, neat, uncompromising. Beside it, in later entries, appeared Samuel Marsh's, firm and steady. His grandfather and his father, binding men to contracts they could not escape, turning their desperation into the Marsh family's gain. Tobias leaned back in his chair, the ledger opened before him, and pressed his hands to his face. The documents did not lie. His family's prosperity had not been forged by hard work alone. It had been built upon the backs of those who had no choice, men who had been driven into a corner until the only way forward was servitude. His father had never spoken of this. His grandfather's pride had never hinted at it. Yet here it was, line after line, signature after signature, a silent chorus of exploitation, written in ink that time could not erase. He turned to another ledger, older still, and found himself staring at a name that chilled him. It was the same name etched on the plaque, the same full name he bore. The entry was brief, a line of debt acknowledged, a note that the land had been seized when payment failed. No record of death, no explanation beyond that. It was as if the man had vanished into the soil, his existence reduced to a transaction. Tobias's throat tightened, and he felt a shudder pass through him. This was no distant stranger. This was kin, erased from memory and record except for this cold notation. His father must have known, his grandfather must have known, and yet nothing had ever been said. The hours wore on, and Tobias moved to the newspapers preserved on microfilm. The old articles flickered on the screen before him, their language stiff with the style of another era. He searched for the name, for any mention of what had happened. At last he found a small piece, buried deep in the pages of 1924. It spoke of a man by that name, noted simply as missing. No details were offered, no inquiry suggested, only a brief acknowledgement that he had not been seen since the autumn before. The article ended with a single line: "The matter remains unresolved." Tobias sat back, staring at the words until they blurred. Unresolved for the world, perhaps, but not for him. He had found the resolution in the field behind his barn, buried beneath a stone, and left for him to discover nearly a century later. When he left the courthouse that evening, the sun was low, the square nearly empty. He walked slowly back to his truck, his body weary not from labor, but from the weight of what he carried in his mind. The truth pressed against him with each step. His family's name, the name he had borne with pride, was written not only in the stories he had been told, but in these documents, these contracts, these silences. It was a name tied not only to resilience, but to cruelty, to the quiet destruction of lives. The drive home was long, the road stretching out before him in the fading light. Tobias's thoughts churned as the fields rolled past, their green beauty tainted now by the knowledge of what had been hidden beneath them. He remembered the voices of his neighbors, the reverence with which they had spoken of the Marsh family, the way the name carried weight in the county. He wondered how many of them had known the truth, how many had chosen to forget or ignore it. Perhaps none, perhaps all. The silence of the community was as deep as the silence of his family. When he reached the farm, the house stood as it always had, its windows dark against the twilight. He stepped inside and set his hat on the table beside the iron box and the plaque. For a long time he stood there looking at them, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The truth was no longer hidden. He had seen it with his own eyes, read it with his own hands. His family's story was not what he had been told. It was darker, sharper, carved in the suffering of others. He sat heavily in the chair, the papers from the courthouse still in his coat pocket, and closed his eyes. The silence of the house pressed on him, but now it was not the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of judgment, of ghosts unacknowledged, of the past demanding to be spoken. Tobias knew that the path ahead would not be easy. To tell the truth would be to tear down the name he had carried all his life, to face the condemnation of neighbors who would not thank him for unearthing old sins. To remain silent would be to carry the weight of complicity, to let the bones in the field rest in unmarked silence. When he opened his eyes, the plaque glimmered faintly in the lamplight, the name carved into it echoing his own. He reached out, touched the metal with his fingertips, and felt a shiver run through him. The past was not gone. It lived in him, in his name, in his land. And now it was his burden to decide what to do with it. The days after Tobias returned from the courthouse unfolded with a strange heaviness, as though the very air of the farm had thickened. The animals moved with their usual rhythm. The sun rose and fell with its accustomed indifference. But everything seemed altered, cast in the shadow of what he had uncovered. The iron box, the plaque, and the papers he had brought from town lay on the kitchen table, untouched yet ever present, like guests who refused to leave. Tobias found himself circling them, avoiding their gaze while never fully able to escape it, as if those relics had become the true masters of the house. He tried to occupy himself with the routines that had always steadied him. He mended fences, carried water, and repaired a broken latch on the barn door. He spread hay in the stalls and tended to the chickens, scattering grain with the same gestures he had repeated for decades. But where once such tasks had given him solace, now they felt like distractions, flimsy veils that could not cover the knowledge pressing against him. Each chore only reminded him that his life had been built upon land soaked in secrets, and that those secrets had been preserved not only by his family's silence, but by the silence of the community around him. It was at church the following Sunday that the weight of that silence revealed itself most keenly. Tobias had not wanted to go, but habit and duty carried him into town. The little white building stood at the edge of the square, its steeple rising against the pale sky. Inside, the wooden pews were filled with neighbors, men and women he had known all his life, their faces lined with the marks of labor and time. They greeted him as they always had, with nods and quiet words, as though nothing had changed. Yet to Tobias, every glance carried an edge. Every handshake lingered with unspoken questions. He wondered if they knew, if their silence mirrored his own, if the truth had always been there beneath the surface, and he had simply never dared to see it. When the pastor spoke of sin and redemption, of the need to bring darkness into light, Tobias felt the words burn in his chest. He sat rigid in the pew, his hands clasped tightly together, his jaw clenched. Around him, the congregation bowed their heads, eyes closed in prayer. He did not bow his. He stared at the wooden cross above the altar, its simple form stark against the white wall, and felt as though it were fixed on him alone, demanding an answer he could not give. When the service ended, he lingered at the doorway, speaking to no one, his mind a storm of unease. In the days that followed, he felt the community's silence in every interaction. At the feed store, men spoke of weather and harvest, their voices easy, their laughter quick. Tobias joined in, but his words felt hollow. He watched their faces, searching for some flicker of knowledge, some sign that they carried the same burden he did. But the conversations remained safe, surface level, as if all of them had agreed never to look too deeply at the soil beneath their lives. At the diner where he sometimes took his breakfast, he heard the same old talk of county politics, of broken tractors, of children grown and moved away. Yet beneath it all, he felt the weight of avoidance, a silence that stretched beyond words, the silence of a town that had chosen to forget. Back at the farm, the silence grew heavier still. He found himself drawn again and again to the northern field, to the stone that marked the grave. He would stand there, his hands in his pockets, staring down at the disturbed soil, feeling the pull of the bones beneath. He thought of the man whose name he shared, of the contracts and ledgers that had reduced him to a line of debt, of the missing persons notice buried in the old newspaper. The man had lived, worked, and died here, erased from memory so thoroughly that only chance had brought him back into the light. Tobias felt both kinship and condemnation in that grave, as if the bones whispered that he too would be judged by what he chose to do with the truth. Nights became the hardest. The old farmhouse, once a place of shelter, now felt like a vessel filled with ghosts. Tobias lay in his bed, the moonlight filtering through the curtains, and listened to the creak of the timbers, the groan of the wind through the eaves. Every sound seemed louder, sharper, as though the house itself demanded reckoning. He dreamed fitful dreams of men's faces blurred by time, of contracts written in blood, of soil that swallowed voices. He would wake with his heart pounding, sweat soaking his shirt, the image of the plaque vivid in his mind. When he rose and went to the window, the northern field lay pale beneath the moon, the stone a small, silent sentinel. He wondered if the farm would ever feel like home again. It was not only the past that pressed on him, but the future. He knew that to carry the truth into the light would be to destroy the name his family had built. The Marsh family was spoken of with respect in the county. Their land was considered a legacy, their endurance admired. To reveal that it had been built on exploitation, on cruelty, on the silencing of a kinsman, would strip that respect away. He imagined the whispers in the diner, the looks in church, the way neighbors would avoid his gaze. He imagined his children, far away in the cities, reading in some paper that their father had exposed the sins of their bloodline. Would they see him as brave or as a traitor to his name? And yet the alternative was unbearable. To remain silent was to live a lie, to walk the land each day knowing that beneath his boots lay the bones of a man forgotten, erased by the very people who had claimed to build a legacy. Each time he thought of burying the plaque again, of locking the iron box away, his stomach twisted. He saw Chester in his mind's eye, the pig who had uncovered the grave, digging with relentless purpose, refusing to let the secret remain hidden. If even an animal could recognize the weight of the truth, how could he deny it? One evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields glowed with fading light, Tobias stood once more at the grave. The air was still, the silence profound, broken only by the distant call of a bird. He felt the presence of the past pressing close, as though the very soil waited for his decision. He knelt and touched the stone, the cool surface rough beneath his hand. He whispered an apology he did not fully understand, words carried away on the evening air. He knew then that silence was no longer an option. The truth demanded to be spoken, no matter the cost. Yet knowing did not make the path easier. Tobias returned to the house, his steps heavy, and sat once more at the kitchen table. The iron box, the plaque, and the papers lay before him. He spread them out, his hands trembling, and stared at them until the lamplight blurred. He thought of his grandfather's journals, of the entry that had spoken of the matter being settled. He thought of the sheriff's badge that had once gleamed in that soil, another fragment of a story too dark to ignore. He thought of the men whose names filled the ledgers, whose lives had been consumed by debts they could never repay. All of them had been silenced, and all of them cried out now through the artifacts that lay before him. The night stretched on, long and heavy. Tobias sat alone, his shoulders bowed, his heart torn between fear and duty. He knew that the next step would change everything. Once he carried the truth into the light, there would be no return to the life he had known. But perhaps that life had never truly been his. Perhaps it had been a lie handed down, preserved in silence and pride. Perhaps the only way forward was through the storm, no matter how much it cost him. When the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Tobias rose from the table. He gathered the papers, the plaque, and the iron box, and placed them carefully in a bundle. He set them on the counter, ready for the journey he knew he must take. His hands trembled, but his resolve had hardened. The silence of his family had lasted too long. It was time for truth to speak, and for him to bear the weight of it. The bundle sat on the counter for 3 days before Tobias found the courage to act. Each morning he would rise, drink his coffee, and see it waiting for him, the plaque and the iron box and the courthouse papers bound together beneath a strip of twine. It seemed to grow heavier the longer it remained untouched, as though the weight of generations pressed within it, demanding he face what had been hidden. Yet each time he reached for it, his hand faltered, his resolve drained by the enormity of what lay ahead. To carry those objects into town, to lay them before officials or historians, or even curious eyes, would be to strip away everything he had believed about his family and himself. It would be to invite judgment, not only from strangers, but from the land itself. The farm seemed to sense his hesitation. The animals grew restless, the air thick with unease. The dog barked at shadows along the fence line, his hackles raised at nothing Tobias could see. The horses clustered at the far end of the pasture, their ears pricked toward the northern field. Even the chickens grew skittish, scattering at the slightest sound. Tobias moved through his chores with weary determination, but always his eyes were drawn back to the stone in the field, the silent marker that had shifted the foundation of his life. It was not only the objects in the kitchen that demanded reckoning, but the grave itself, the man beneath it, the bloodline twisted around secrets too dark to ignore. One evening, as twilight deepened over the land, Tobias returned to his grandfather's old trunk in the attic. He had avoided it since uncovering the journals, reluctant to disturb whatever else might be hidden within. But now he felt compelled, as though the past itself had summoned him upward, urging him to seek what remained. The attic smelled of dust and age, the beams creaking softly under his weight. He knelt before the trunk, its leather cracked, its lock stiff, and forced it open. Inside lay more notebooks, their pages brittle with time, and a bundle of letters tied with faded string. Tobias lifted them carefully, his hands trembling as he untied the knot and unfolded the first sheet. The handwriting was his grandfather's, unmistakable in its sharp strokes. The letter was addressed to Samuel Marsh, his father, though the words were written decades before Tobias's birth. The language was terse, almost cold, yet the meaning was clear. It spoke of debts collected, of men who had failed to pay, of land acquired through their losses. But beneath those businesslike phrases ran a darker current. One line in particular froze Tobias where he sat. The matter of Webb is concluded. His presence will trouble us no more. Tobias's heart pounded as he read the words again and again, the name searing into his mind. Webb, the sheriff whose badge he had once pulled from the soil, the man whose disappearance had been marked only by a brief newspaper notice. He turned to the next letter, and the next. The story unfolded in fragments, each piece sharpening the picture. Marcus Webb had not vanished of his own accord. He had stood against the Marsh family, challenging their practices, questioning the contracts that bound men into endless servitude. He had been a thorn in their side, a threat to their profits, perhaps even to their hold on the land itself. And then he had disappeared, buried in the same soil that bore Tobias's name. His grandfather's words left little room for doubt. Webb had been silenced deliberately, his death cloaked in secrecy, his body hidden where no one would think to look. Tobias sat back against the trunk, the letters trembling in his hands. The shadows of the attic seemed to close in around him, heavy with the presence of ancestors who had chosen violence over justice, greed over honor. His chest tightened, his breath shallow. He had suspected before, but suspicion had been easier to bear than confirmation. Now there was no doubt. His family had not only exploited the poor and desperate, they had killed to preserve their power, and they had buried their crime in the same land Tobias had tended all his life. The discovery left him hollow. He felt betrayed by the very blood in his veins, by the stories told to him in childhood, by the silence that had shaped his understanding of himself. He thought of his father, stern and proud, never speaking of these things, carrying the weight of them in silence. Had Samuel known of Webb's fate? Had he too stood by, complicit in that silence, preserving the family's name at the cost of truth? Tobias could not say, but the question gnawed at him. The silence of his ancestors was louder now than any confession could have been. It echoed through the house, through the fields, through his very bones. That night he sat at the kitchen table with the letters spread before him, the iron box and plaque pushed aside. The lamplight flickered across the faded ink, casting shadows that seemed to move with the words. Tobias poured whiskey into a glass but did not drink, his hands too unsteady to lift it. He thought of Ruth, her quiet faith in justice, her belief that wrongs must be righted no matter the cost. He imagined her sitting across from him, her eyes steady, her voice gentle but firm. She would not have hesitated. She would have told him that silence was a sin, that truth must be spoken even if it burned the world around them. But Ruth was gone, and Tobias sat alone, the choice his to bear. Sleep did not come easily. When he did drift into slumber, his dreams were dark, filled with images of men with hollow eyes, of soil stained with blood, of a sheriff's badge glinting in the moonlight. He woke gasping, his sheets damp with sweat, the weight of his ancestors pressing down like a stone on his chest. He rose before dawn, lit the lamp, and returned to the letters, reading them again and again as if repetition might dull their sting. But the words remained sharp, unyielding, demanding. In the days that followed, Tobias withdrew further from the world. He avoided the diner, the feed store, even church. He could not bear the faces of his neighbors, the easy way they spoke of crops and weather, the silence that cloaked them all. Did they know? Had they heard whispers of Webb's disappearance, of the Marsh family's part in it? Or had they chosen, like his ancestors, to bury the truth beneath silence? Tobias could not tell, but the thought gnawed at him, isolating him further, until the farm felt less like home than like a prison built of secrets. He spent long hours in the northern field, standing by the stone, staring down at the soil that held both kin and stranger alike. The ground seemed to pulse with memory, each breath of wind carrying whispers of what had been buried. Tobias spoke aloud sometimes, his voice low, as if addressing the man beneath. He offered apologies, though he knew they could never be enough. He promised truth, though he had not yet found the strength to deliver it. The soil did not answer, but the silence pressed harder, as though waiting for him to act. The weight of legacy grew unbearable. Tobias felt it in his bones, in the ache of his muscles, in the hollowness of his chest. The farm that had once given him purpose now mocked him with every sunrise, each acre a reminder of blood spilled and lives ruined. He could no longer take pride in the fences he mended, the crops he planted, the animals he tended. All of it was tainted, rooted in corruption, stained by the silence of those who had come before. He began to wonder if the land itself would ever forgive him, if the soil would ever yield peace again. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Tobias stood in the field with the plaque in one hand and the sheriff's badge in the other. The objects felt heavy, their weight out of proportion to their size. He looked at them, then at the grave, then back at the house silhouetted against the fading light. He thought of fire, of destruction, of casting all of it into the flames and letting the past burn away. But he knew it would not vanish so easily. The truth could not be destroyed. It could only be spoken or silenced. carried openly or buried deeper. The choice was his, and it tore at him like claws. That night, he sat once more at the kitchen table, the letters spread before him, the badge gleaming faintly in the lamplight. He bowed his head, his hands pressed together, and whispered a prayer, though he had not prayed in years. He asked for strength, for clarity, for the courage to do what must be done. The house was silent, the farm beyond it, hushed, the world holding its breath. Tobias raised his head, his jaw set, and knew that the moment of decision was near. The night after Tobias whispered his broken prayer stretched on endlessly, every tick of the hallway clock echoing through the house, like the toll of some ancient bell. He sat at the kitchen table long after the lamp had sputtered and burned low, his eyes fixed on the letters, the iron box, the plaque, and the tarnished badge laid before him in silent judgment. The silence was no longer just silence. It had become a presence, thick and expectant, as though the house itself leaned closer to hear what decision he would make. Outside, the farm was steeped in shadow, the wind still, the fields vast and indifferent beneath the pale light of the moon. The land, too, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him. When dawn broke at last, gray and brittle, Tobias felt no relief. He had not slept, only drifted in and out of restless thoughts, his body as weary as his mind. He rose from the table stiffly, his movements heavy, and crossed to the window. The fields stretched before him in their familiar way, but they no longer offered comfort. The northern field was a wound now, raw and open, the stone at its center a constant reminder of all he had unearthed. He rested his hand on the sill, his fingers trembling, and whispered to himself, though his words carried no more conviction than the breath that formed them. The time had come to act. The hours that followed moved with a strange clarity, as though the weight of his decision had stripped away all else. He carried water to the horses, mended a broken hinge in the barn, and scattered feed for the chickens, not out of habit but as a farewell to the routines that had once sustained him. Every action seemed final, every gesture a closing of some chapter. The dog followed him more closely than usual, watching him with eyes that seemed to know more than they should, as though even the animal sensed the gravity of what lay ahead. When the chores were done, Tobias returned to the house and gathered the bundle. The letters, the plaque, the badge, the courthouse papers, he tied them together with twine and held them against his chest. The weight was small in the arms, yet crushing in the soul. He set them on the passenger seat of his truck, started the engine, and pulled out onto the road that led into town. The morning was still, the horizon washed in pale light, but Tobias felt as though he were driving into a storm. The courthouse loomed before him, the same building where he had uncovered so much only days before. As he parked and sat staring at its stone facade, fear twisted in his gut. To step inside with his burden would be to strip his family bare, to offer their sins to the light of day. He imagined the clerks, the officials, the historians who would pore over the papers, the whispers that would ripple through the county when the truth emerged. He thought of the neighbors he had known all his life, the faces at church, the men at the feed store. He saw their eyes narrowing, their hands drawing back, their voices speaking his name not with respect, but with contempt. He saw his children reading about him in some newspaper, their father the man who had turned the Marsh legacy into ruin. His hand gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his breath shallow. He could not move. The courthouse doors seemed impossibly far. Each step that would carry him toward them weighted with shame and dread. At last, with a low groan, he turned the key, shut off the engine, and sat in silence. Minutes passed, then longer. Finally, he started the truck again, turned from the square, and drove away. The road carried him not home at first, but outward, past the town, past fields that were not his, past fences that bore other men's names. He drove without thinking, the landscape sliding past in silence. He did not stop until he reached the river, its wide waters glinting beneath the midday sun. He pulled to the side, killed the engine, and sat staring at the current. In his mind, he saw himself walking down to the bank, hurling the bundle into the water, watching the badge and the plaque and the letters vanish beneath the waves. He imagined the current swallowing them, carrying them far downstream until they were lost forever. The past would sink with them, its weight lifted from his shoulders, leaving him free to return to his farm, to his routines, to his silence. But as he sat there, the thought curdled. He saw Chester's relentless digging, the way the hog had refused to stop until the grave was opened. He heard Ruth's voice, steady and sure, insisting that silence was complicity, that the truth demanded to be spoken. He looked down at the bundle on the seat beside him, the twine tied around it, the plaque's hard edge pressing faintly against the paper wrapping. He could not do it. To cast them into the river would not erase what had been done. It would only make him the next in line to bury the truth, to silence the dead for the sake of the living. The river would carry away the evidence, but not the guilt. That guilt would remain, coiled within him, poisoning him as surely as it had poisoned his father and his grandfather. He bowed his head, his hands trembling on his knees, and let out a shuddering breath. He could not destroy the truth. He could not bury it again. Whether he had the strength to carry it into the light, he did not yet know. But silence was no longer an option. By the time Tobias returned to the farm, the sun was low, painting the fields in long shadows. He parked the truck in the yard, lifted the bundle carefully, and carried it inside. He set it once more on the kitchen table, the same place it had sat before. But now it felt different. No longer a weight to be avoided, it had become a promise, a burden he had chosen to bear. He poured himself a glass of water, drank deeply, and sat staring at the bundle until darkness fell. That night he rose from the table and carried a lantern out to the northern field. The air was cool, the stars sharp against the black sky. The stone stood before him, its surface pale in the lantern's glow. He knelt beside it, set the lantern on the ground, and untied the bundle. He laid the plaque against the stone, placed the letters at its base, and set the badge carefully atop the soil of the grave. His hands lingered there, fingers pressed into the earth, as though he could reach through the soil and touch the man beneath. "I will not bury you again," he whispered, his voice raw. "I don't know what comes next, but I will not bury you again." The night held his words, carried them away into silence, but the silence felt different now. Not oppressive, not accusing, but expectant, as though the farm itself had shifted, recognizing the weight of his vow. Tobias sat there long into the night, the lantern flickering, the stars wheeling overhead, until at last he rose, his knees stiff, his chest heavy but steady. In the morning he would begin again. He would take the bundle to those who could not look away, the sheriff's office, the historians, perhaps even the papers. He would face the judgment that would come, from neighbors, from children, from the land itself. His name would be tarnished, his family's legacy shattered, but the truth would breathe again, and the silence that had lasted a century would finally end. As he walked back toward the house, the lantern swinging in his hand, Tobias felt the weight in his chest shift. It was still heavy, but it was no longer the weight of indecision. It was the weight of burden accepted, of truth chosen. Behind him, the grave lay quiet, the badge gleaming faintly in the dawn's first light, a promise that the past would not be forgotten. And for the first time in many nights, Tobias felt a flicker of peace. If this story left you speechless, don't stop here. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss the next shocking twist. Click on the next video on your screen and dive straight into another true story that will blow your mind. And don't keep this secret to yourself. Share this video with your friends and see what they think.